I just want to throw this out there. Sitting in a really squeaky chair today. So you hear some noises. It's not like it's my chair, which technically I could get up and, swap chairs out, but that would take effort. Not something that I have at this point in the school year. We're going to continue our riveting talk about paper just because I know you couldn't get enough. I know it's not that exciting, but like I said, paper is the basis for almost all of the projects we do with our students, and therefore it's pretty stinking vital. Today we're going to be talking about watercolor paper. Personally, I don't have that like Kardashian level of budget. I usually do not purchase watercolor paper. A bit expensive, and because I use that aforementioned 80-pound, 124 GSM paper, it can usually withstand the weight of watercolor paint. I often have to do some ironing of the paper because it does tend to warp. The beauty of watercolor paper, it usually doesn't warp. The other thing I've noticed when working with my students in watercolor paper is the colors of the paint really do seem to pop a whole lot more. In those years when I actually have extra money in my budget, when has that ever happened? Then that's when I might order some watercolor paper. But just like the other kind of paper, you open up that Art Supply catalog and it gets real confusing real fast. Remember how we chatted about the difference between pound of paper and GSM, and how I recommended getting 80-pound paper being the best? For watercolor paper, it's going to be that higher number of weight or GSM. However, some of it can get to be as high as 300-pound paper. I'm sorry, that's not going to be purchased for my art room. Instead, what you can look for in watercolor paper for student grade is between 90 to 140-pound paper, which is 300 GSM. Now, you might even notice when you're looking through watercolor paper that there's some talk about the amount of pressure used in the creation of that paper. There's hot pressed, cold pressed, and rough paper. This tells you a little bit about the texture of the paper and what watercolor techniques it's best suited for. For example, hot pressed paper receives the greatest amount of compression, which means it's going to be a really smooth watercolor paper, which is great if you're doing a lot of fine, detailed work. Rough paper receives very little pressure, so it's going to be that watercolor paper that's a little bit lumpy and bumpy. Cold pressed paper is kind of like the Goldilocks of the paper because it's just right. It receives the right amount of pressure, has the right amount of texture, and it's great for watercolor painting. And I'm just throwing all of this out there in case you decide to teach middle school or high school, or you yourself want to venture into the wild and wacky world of watercolor painting. In an elementary art room, however, all of this stuff is probably way more than you need to know. I would recommend getting that watercolor paper that's from 90 to 140 pounds. Now let's do a little bit of side by side to actually see what's the difference between that 80-pound regular paper and watercolor paper.
One of the things I noticed when I was comparing these two papers is that watercolor paper doesn't dry very quickly, which is great because then it allows you to move the paint around, mix colors together, and you're going to notice I do some experimenting with it as I go on. One thing I noticed about the regular drawing paper, the 80-pound paper, is that it tends to absorb the paper a little bit more, making it so you can't do those watercolor techniques. But that's kind of where the differences ended. I was surprised to see that they were both very similar. They offered very similar results, and I like them both. So there you have it. There's a side-by-side comparison.